Week 3 Overview. Wilson's Reforms and Europe's War. This is another busy and fascinating week planned. We continue our study of American history by looking at the first term of President Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1917, and study Europe by looking at the onset of World War I, which erupted about 1 year into Wilson's first term. Wilson had big ideas for America as he began his first administration. He had already led Congress to pass a few of his key reforms in July of 1914 when events across the Atlantic changed the world. It started when a Serbian terrorist shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austro-Hungarian soldiers attacked Little Serbia. Interlocking alliances across Europe kicked into effect. France was pledged to defend Serbia. Germany supported Austria. Belgium got run over when German armies headed off to attack France. Britain and Russia were drawn into the conflict. As every major European power got pulled in, along with all their foreign colonies, plus Turkey and Japan, it seemed like almost all the world was at war by the end of 1914. Almost all. America wanted no part of it. Though many European immigrants who had recently come to America boarded steamships to go home and fight, or stayed in America to talk loudly of what was going on back in Europe, most Americans were happy to allow the Europeans to fight to the death if that's what they wanted to do. Wilson declared America officially neutral, and urged Americans to be neutral in thought and deed. We'll study why America finally got into the war in Week 5, but there was a lot of pressure on Wilson to jump in earlier. When Germany started sinking American ships, for example, people said Wilson had ice in his veins, not blood. But Wilson had Southern blood in his veins, not ice, and that affected his response to war. He was raised in the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and he had seen firsthand the devastation of war and its aftermath. He wanted to keep America out of war. Wilson was born in Virginia in 1856, just 4 years before war broke out between North and South. His family moved to Georgia when he was 2. He was an impressionable lad of 7 when General Sherman marched from Atlanta to the sea. Woodrow Wilson was homeschooled for a time. He started off at a traditional school after the Civil War ended, but he struggled to read. His father, a Presbyterian minister, took him out of school and taught him to write and speak instead of relying wholly on reading assignments. Eventually, Wilson became a good reader as well, but he remained a strong writer and speaker from his early home training. His father cared as much about right and wrong as about reading and writing. He gave his boy a moral compass that Woodrow Wilson followed for the rest of his life. Wilson studied law, but he didn't like being a lawyer. He went back to school for a Ph.D. in political science, which makes him the only president yet to have earned a doctorate. He became president of Princeton University after having been a professor of political economy there for 12 years. In 1911, Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey. He was a progressive Democrat. At that time, the government of New Jersey was particularly corrupt. The political bosses in the state thought a newcomer to politics would be easy to control, so they threw their weight behind Wilson. Imagine their surprise when he took the government firmly in hand and cleaned up a significant amount of corruption while he was in office. Wilson had only been in that first elected office for 1 year when he ran for president of the United States. It usually takes a little more political experience than that to win the highest office in the land, but as we noted last week, Wilson ran against Republican Howard Taft and third-party candidate Teddy Roosevelt. With the Bull Moose Party splitting off Republican votes, Wilson won the election of 1912. He took office with a plan for reform at the federal level. Wilson started with the tariff question. He thought one reason America had such big monopolies was that there wasn't enough competition in some industries. Tariffs kept overseas competitors out of the American market by artificially raising the price of American goods. American businessmen could keep their own prices and profits high by pushing for protective tariffs. In 1913, Wilson drastically cut all tariffs and eliminated them completely from products that Americans produced cheaply and in abundance, such as food, wool, steel, and iron. Wilson went after the banking system next. He believed banks should not be controlled by a few private individuals. He wanted the government to run the banks. In 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve System bill that established the Federal Reserve Bank and its oversight group, the Federal Reserve Board. Also established were 12 regional banks, where federal deposits were kept. The Federal Reserve Board was tasked with setting interest rates, managing the sale and purchase of federal bonds, and determining the amount of paper money, backed by gold, that was issued. Wilson's new Federal Trade Commission targeted big business. It had authority to approve or deny business mergers before they occurred, and to prevent the formation of trusts among private companies. Wilson signed a law that protected unions from the Sherman Antitrust Act, an 1890 law that prohibited any kind of combination or conspiracy in restraint of trade. Although the Sherman Act had been passed to rein in big corporations, it had turned out to be just as effective at stopping labor unions, since strikes and boycotts always combine individual workers in restraining trade. The new Clayton Act specifically allowed the formation of unions and the use of collective bargaining, picketing, and strikes. Wilson also urged Congress to appropriate more money for education and highway construction, enacted an 8-hour workday and unemployment compensation laws for federal workers, and signed bills that helped farmers get credit and loans. He also signed a bill that limited child labor for children under 14, but the Supreme Court overturned that law in 1918. One change Wilson didn't make was in race relations, despite the fact that he had promised to improve conditions for black folks during his campaign for president. Once he took office, he was strangely inactive on this promise. Instead of bettering conditions for blacks, he actually segregated black and white federal workers. When confronted about this, he said it was for the protection of black workers. Historians have yet to come up with a satisfying explanation for Wilson's failure on this particular point. As Wilson was changing America, events across the Atlantic were changing the world. Rhetoric-level students have spent the last 2 weeks learning about the factors and forces that led to World War I. Here's a short version of how it happened for our overview. The spark that detonated all of Europe was struck in Serbia. That little region of the Balkans was given its independence at the conclusion of a war between Russia and Turkey in 1878. The Serbs wanted the neighboring territory that was populated by the closely related ethnic group called Bosnians, but the treaty between Russia and Turkey gave Bosnia to Austria-Hungary instead. Nobody was all that happy with the deal at the time. Austria coveted Serbia, Serbia coveted Bosnia, and Bosnia wanted its independence. 36 years later, things hadn't changed that much in the Balkans. A secret Serbian organization called the Black Hand hired and trained 3 Bosnian activists to assassinate the Archduke of Austria on his visit to Serbia and then commit suicide so that no one could ever trace the killers. The plan was only half successful. The terrorists killed the Archduke, but not themselves. Their cyanide pills were duds. When Austria discovered that the Black Hand had set up the assassination, they blamed the Serbian government for the killing. They insisted Serbia should accept responsibility and pay damages. When Serbia refused to comply with every last detail, Austria-Hungary finally had the excuse it needed to declare war on Serbia. Now, the Balkans may not have changed that much in the decades since Russia and Turkey went to war in 1878, but the rest of Europe had. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. 3 days later, Serbia's ally Russia began to mobilize its troops. Germany saw this as an aggressive move against its ally, Austria, and declared war on Russia on August 1st. Great Britain and France were allied to Russia, so France mobilized troops in support of Russia. The French support of Russia moved Germany to declare war on France on August 3rd. Germany marched into neutral Belgium and Little Luxembourg to attack France's undefended Belgian border. Britain had long been pledged to aid neutral Belgium, so Germany's invasion called Britain to declare war on Germany on August 4th. It only took 7 days, from July 28th to August 4th, for the dominoes to fall all over Europe. If the problem with Europe was all the interlocking alliances, well then why did little neutral Belgium end up on the front lines? It was all part of the Schlieffen Plan. Back in 1899, German military theorists thought through the implications of war in Europe. Alfred von Schlieffen thought France would hit Germany from the west and Russia from the east. Schlieffen thought Russia would need about 6 weeks to mobilize its troops, though, because their railroads were so primitive. That would give Germany time to take out France, except that France had built major fortifications along its border with Germany. Schlieffen's plan was to race west through undefended Belgium and then south to Paris and force France to surrender in the very first few weeks of the war. Germany could then pull its fighting forces back by rail to defend the Eastern Front from Russia. Unfortunately for Germany, no military plan survives first contact with the enemy. Belgium put up a real resistance to the German advance, and Britain rushed in troops to support them. Russia took everyone by surprise by moving troops into East Prussia, what is now Poland, within days. The German army could not reach Paris, and quickly enough had to defend the ground that they'd taken there on the Western Front. Europeans on both sides of the conflict had confidently expected to win the war that started in July 1914 by Christmas of that year, but nobody realized how new weaponry would change the course of war. Machine guns turned battlefields into killing fields. Men who stepped out into the open were torn to shreds. If you wanted to stay alive, you had to take cover, and that meant digging trenches. Soldiers dug down instead of marching forward. Since neither side knew when the enemy might try to break through the lines, they stayed down where they were shielded from most of the enemy fire, except for weapons like mortars that lobbed explosive shells up and dropped them straight down on the heads of huddled soldiers. Trench warfare was an unending nightmare of boredom punctuated by panic, such as the occasional assault across no man's land into the teeth of machine guns and artillery which mowed men down like blades of grass. That was the Western Front, but it was not the only front. There was war with Russia in the east and various European colonies around the globe. Both the Allies and the Central Powers fought outside of Europe in foreign lands. Thus the war, which was initially referred to as the Great War, took on another name, the World War. We'll spend 2 more weeks learning about life and death in the trenches. It's going to get grim. More than 15 million people died before it finally ended in 1918, not counting those who died in the Russian Revolution of 1917. And this is just the First World War. Be sensitive as you lead your children through these next few weeks. It can be hard for them to see how a loving God could permit so much suffering. They'll need your faith and your wisdom in the weeks to come.